Let's finish now with part three of our lecture, A New Global Age, focusing now on European expansion in an age of accelerating connections. This is when history starts to go on fast forward, you might say, as modernity takes shape on the oceans and continents of trade, exploration, travel, exchange, conquest. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And such is the simple rhyme that school kids have learned for generations, particularly in the studying of United States history, where Columbus, it seems, often begins as the starting point for the history of the United States to follow. Now, there's, I think, plenty wrong with that simplified picture. Because, among other things, it suggests that Columbus had some notion that he was discovering America. He, of course, was following Marco Polo's travels, or so he thought, to find what he called the Indies, meaning not the Western Hemisphere, but the Far East Indies, including China, Japan, and the Indonesian Spice Islands. Having severely underestimated the actual length of that journey, Columbus instead found himself in the Western Hemisphere, in the environs of the what will be called now West Indies of the Caribbean Sea. He never does reach North America, which makes the familiar claim even stranger that Columbus discovered America, since in not any of his four journeys does he set eyes on the North American landmass. He touches down on the islands of Hispaniola and surrounding islands. He sails the coastline of South America, but never North America. So, yeah, there's a lot to unpack with the mythology of Columbus. The flat earth business, that had nothing to do with it, of course. That was an old myth from the Middle Ages. Columbus knew full well, as did other educated people of his time, that the earth was spherical. He just thought it was smaller than it actually was. And at the point where he thought he should have been in the East Indies, he was, unbeknownst to him, in what we call the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, and the islands of the Caribbean Sea. But sometimes making a mistake in history is just as important as getting it right. And Columbus's famous mistake now will complete a connection that we've seen building, that is, of oceanic travel from the Chinese treasure ships and the Arab dhows of the Indian Ocean to now the European, the Spanish, and Portuguese caravels in the Atlantic waters, completing a connection that we've seen developing throughout the new global age, the post-classical period, the era of third-wave civilizations, of which Columbus is now a part, a connection, a global connection to be made, ushering in, as we say, the modern age. Columbus was the product of a Mediterranean maritime crossroads. And I think that's the other problem with the starting point of Columbus in American history, is that we see Columbus as doing something new, something original, a voyage of discovery. Well, Columbus will be unique enough, I suppose, in his determination across the Atlantic. He's not the first European to sail in the Atlantic, of course. Others before him, including Norsemen, that is Scandinavians, as well as Basque sailors, cod fishermen, had been sailing about in the Atlantic, perhaps even making contact with the land masses. The Scandinavian settlements of Nova Scotia, for example, suggest a tentative connection previously. But the fact is that not until Columbus will a permanent and ongoing connection be made between the Eastern and Western Hemisphere. And yet, for all of that, Columbus himself was not so much the originator of something as he was the product of something. He was the culmination of a tradition of seafaring that had started in the Mediterranean centuries earlier. And so I want to take a look at this maritime crossroads culture of the Mediterranean Sea. And as you look at the map here, and you see the Mediterranean, and you see where Columbus is from here in northwest Italy, from the city-state of Genoa, and you see Spain and Portugal, and the Straits of Gibraltar, the narrow entry and exit point from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. What you're really looking at is a kind of vast network of trade and travel and ocean-going connection, much of which was centered around the northern coasts of Africa and what we'd call the Arab and Berber trades, Muslim trades of North Africa. Remember, Spain itself had been largely Muslim for almost 600 years by the time Columbus comes around. And so Arab and Berber and folks even from farther afield, Persians, Middle Easterners, Syrians, Lebanese, sailors, all of them in the Mediterranean, to mix with now what will be Columbus's Catholic Christian culture of Europe. In fact, Columbus will be quite forthcoming about how his own education as a sailor mariner is shaped by the many and diverse peoples outside the Christian realm, including Muslims and Jews and others, he says, of many religions. And it's from these vast seafaring traditions, connecting all the way to the Indian Ocean and beyond, that Europeans will acquire many of their own maritime technologies. During the age of Columbus, the caravel was the basic ship design which Europeans used for ocean-going travel, which, as it turns out, is derived in large measure from the Arab dhow ships of the Indian Ocean. They both had several features in common, including a stem or stern rather post rudder here. That is a steering mechanism in the back of the ship. You see the rudder on the Arab dhow. You see it on the Portuguese caravel. They had a stern cargo hold. That is a place to store the commodities which they wished to trade. They had a pointed prow in the front where the ship's forward or stem region narrowed. They had sails, of course, often triangular sails, the Latin sail design that was pioneered in the Indian Ocean. They had swiveling masts for that rigging, as did the Arab dhow design. Of course, we say the Arab dhow, but the dhow itself was an amalgam of styles from India, Arabia, and Africa. So multicultural technology imparted here to Europeans from the 13th century Arab pirate boat or dhow featured in this scene to the European caravel. Developing on these basic technologies, of course, the Europeans would continue to innovate, but basically a cultural endowment is what gets them started. Prior to this time, the European sailing vessels had square sails and no stern post rudder, and were really only coastal vessels, square bottomed. These inheritances of technology from the Indian Ocean are going to be critical for Europe's ability to sail confidently on the ocean seas. And the two city-states that first staked their claim as maritime states, Christopher Columbus's Genoa in the northwest corner of India, and Venice, from which Marco Polo came, of course, in the northeast corner. And it is Genoa and Venice, two rival Italian city-states. Remember, there's no unified Italian country at this point, but Genoa and Venice, each of them maritime republics in great competition with each other, as you can see, mostly for trade throughout the eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea region. It was in Constantinople, for example, where Marco Polo's Fraterna was established. That is the family business, the cloth business. So you had Venetians and Genoese in these points of interest throughout the Black Sea and Asia Minor. But what we need to do is get Europeans westward. If we're going to get to Columbus by 1492, we need to get a westward orientation, and so we will. But along the way, developing a maritime economy, which includes now Genoese silver coins, so-called dinero coins, derived from the Arab dinar coins. And you can tell these are not Muslim coins because of the cross, the Christian cross that is imprinted in the Genoese silver dinero coin. Columbus's hometown of Genoa held an advantage over its rival Venice in that from the beginning the Genoese were, well, as mythology had it, Janus-faced. The Roman god Janus, a twin god with two faces, was the inspiration for the name of Genoa. From Janus we get Genoa. And it was this two-way looking city-state, this maritime republic, which not only held an eastern bearing but also a western bearing that would see its sailors, including Christopher Columbus, sailing beyond the gates of Gibraltar. Genoa, Spain, and Portugal, that is, formed a kind of nucleus of Western Mediterranean trading interests, competing with one another for wealth and power and for the bragging rights of Christendom. And the commodity that really pushes these states west into the Atlantic, into the near Atlantic Ocean, the commodity above all, even gold, was sugarcane. Sugar becomes the most valuable trade good, which inspires European efforts to colonize the near Atlantic islands just outside the Straits of Gibraltar. Europeans had first learned to cultivate sugar from Muslims in the Eastern Mediterranean. They were unable to cultivate sugar in their home territories. The climate, the soil, the temperatures were all wrong. And so they needed more southerly latitudes, that is land whose soil was productive for sugar and whose climate and temperatures were productive for sugar. Sugar was worth its weight in gold, so inspired, you might say, with the palates of now well-heeled European city folk, people living in Venice, people living in Genoa and elsewhere, who had the wherewithal economically to purchase sugar to sweeten their coffee or their tea or to make baked goods. We know that sucrose has its own near addictive properties, and so guaranteeing a customer base, sugar was the great trade commodity of the 16th century, the 15th and 16th century. By the 1420s, Portugal's Prince Henry sponsors a school for navigation. Borrowing from the Genoese and others, he invites Muslim Arabs and Jewish cartographers to Christian Portugal now to be part of a brains trust and a new school for navigation located at the headlands point of Sagres, where Portugal meets the Atlantic Ocean. And Portugal as a country is entirely oriented toward the Atlantic Ocean. That is to say, all of its coastline is met by the waters of the Atlantic. And so it is that Portugal will take the lead from Genoa in exploring the islands of the near Atlantic, using what the Genoese had learned and what others could bring to bear in the task of exploration. Ultimately connecting with West Africa and beyond. You see, what the Portuguese had learned from their raids in the North African coast was that the peoples of North Africa, of Algeria and Morocco, the Berber peoples, had long carried out a camel trade, a caravan trade across the Sahara Desert with the peoples of the Niger River region, where gold and spices and cotton fabrics and even slaves could be had. And so inspiring now the Portuguese expansion, maritime expansion, are not only dreams of reaching the Indies, that is, the East Indies, the places which Marco Polo had described, but also, closer to home, the trade points of West Africa. The problem was the Portuguese, of course, knew so very little about the geography of Africa. That they really had to find their way, league by league, you might say, along the West African coastline. Sponsoring voyage after voyage, expedition after expedition, the Portuguese finally will make contact with sub-Saharan West Africa by the 1440s. And from the 1440s until the time of Columbus in the 1490s, a half century of Portuguese exploration and contact with the peoples of West Africa, who they find immediately to be, of course, their own rivals as far as civilizing influences go. As we look here on the map from Portugal here to the north, down along the vast stretch of the West African landmass, eventually turning the corner here toward the Bight of Benin, as geographers call it, and establishing a trading zone along the coastal stretches. Because I say the Portuguese found the West Africans to be they're very much their equals when it came to civilizing influences, far from being a backwards or uncivilized people. The states of West Africa, as we know, had developed their own imperial traditions over many, many, many centuries. And through trade across the Sahara with Arab and Berber traders, the West Africans had grown powerful militarily and economically in their own right. So the best that the Portuguese could hope to do was to buy into the trade here along the coastal stretches and to turn one African potentate against another. That is, to take advantage perhaps of rivalries, local and regional rivalries among West African peoples who, far from being unified, were just as diverse, just as decentralized in their governing and in their culture and in their languages as the people of Europe were themselves. And here you see a picture of one such Portuguese castle, that is, trading fortress, at a place called Elmina in West Africa. In the Portuguese, it was now called São Jorge da Mina, that is, Saint George in the Catholic tradition, Saint George of the Mines. And it was called that because much of the gold that was mined in West Africa seemed to come from this region. And thus the western coast of this stretch was itself called the Gold Coast, something that inspired the Portuguese a great deal. But as the Portuguese arrived in the coast of West Africa in the 1400s, in the decades preceding Columbus, they came not as peaceful emissaries of trade, but rather as armed conquerors forced to make treaties with those of West Africa, but never giving up their designs on what could be a maritime empire. In other words, they came as traders, yes, but also as conquistadors. That is, as religious zealots determined to claim for Christendom the vast stretches of terra incognita, that is, the areas not clearly defined on their map, the areas of Africa and beyond to the Indian Ocean. And this intent was emblazoned in the sails of their ships. The gigantic crosses sewn into the sails of their caravels announced their intention now as conquistadors, with their motives equally gold, God, and glory for Christendom. Even the money they derived, for example, the gold that they got from West Africa, they traded from the West African states, they coined into new currency, into new coinage, and again emblazoned the Christian cross on their Portuguese coin, which, by the way, were known as cruzados. Cruzado, the Portuguese word for crusader. And the crusaders were religious soldiers, equal parts, I think, soldiers, businessmen, explorers, traders. Or as one historian called them, the Mongols of the ocean. Because like the Mongols of the Asian landmass, they came in conquest, but were interested in connecting through cultures, an exchange of trade value that would help unite various far-flung reaches of the globe in a growing matrix of trade and conquest. And that conquest by the time of Columbus would, of course, include the Western Hemisphere, as Columbus simply followed the Portuguese and the Genoese before him on a slightly different compass direction bearing due west across the Atlantic. Others had gone west and southwest across the Atlantic to boomerang around to the West African coast using the westerly winds that pushed them from the west to the east. But Columbus instead heads straight into those winds, if you will, hoping to find a shorter route, trade route that is, with Asia, circumventing the great Ottoman Empire as the middleman between Europe and Asia by going through a maritime route and connecting directly with Asia. Instead, of course, what he belatedly found was the West Indies, although it is not on any of his maps, and truth be told, not even to his dying day does Columbus ever acknowledge anything other than connecting with Asia. That is, to his deathbed, Columbus will assert that he has found a short route to Asia, when in fact, as others who quickly follow in his wake will learn, that this was a hemisphere unto itself, a place that will come to be called the Americas out of deference to Amerigo Vespucci, a successor of Columbus, who rightly recognized Columbus's mistake. We know the tragic consequences for the peoples of the America, who now exposed not only to Portuguese and Spanish ideas of conquest, but also more insidiously to Old World Eurasian diseases. As Robert Straya writes, although the densest webs of connection had been woven within the Afro-Eurasian zone of interaction, this huge region had no sustained ties with the Americas, and neither of them had meaningful contact with the peoples of Pacific Oceania. That situation was about to change as Europeans in the 16th century and beyond forged a set of genuinely global relationships that linked all of these regions. That enormous process and the many consequences that flowed from it marked the beginning of what historians commonly call the modern age. And it was in this modern age that a new global economy will take shape. In the Atlantic world of the Western Hemisphere, you see the many and sundry connections of continents, Europe, Africa, North America, South America, and the islands of the West Indies, all of them knitted together now through the impetus of European exploration, contact, and economic development. The so-called triangular trade that will really inspire the rise of the first great capitalist institutions, the great insurance corporations, the great banking corporations that will invest in these long-distance ocean-going voyages of trade and commerce. Also implicit in this picture with a connection to Africa is one of the great and tragic consequences. In addition to the spread of epidemic diseases throughout the Americas. In combination, it was the devastating effect of epidemic disease on the native peoples of America, along with the introduction of an entirely new population that has historians discussing now how an entire hemisphere was repeopled, an entire hemisphere repopulated through the aegis of the transatlantic slave trade. Those same European shipping firms, along with their banking and insurance investors, were able to broker and trade with the states of West Africa, acquire by force, by purchase, the labor of African people who now, enslaved as chattel, that is, as financially owned property, would be forced to migrate across the Atlantic Ocean, beginning in the early 1500s down to the late 1800s. So many that 3 out of 4 arrivals to the Americas by the 1700s were not from Europe, but from Africa. Think of that for a second. The dominant migrating population to the Americas came not as free people seeking refuge or safe haven in the Americas, but rather as enslaved men and women forced from their homelands, bought and sold and shipped across the Atlantic between the 1500s and 1880s. They constituted a majority of arrivals. More than 12 million Africans made the voyage of the so-called Middle Passage. And again, your textbook author, Robert Strayer. The previously separate worlds of Afro-Eurasia, the Americas, and the Pacific Oceania became inextricably linked, with enormous consequences for everyone involved. Global empires, a global economy, global cultural exchanges, global migrations, global disease, global wars, and global environmental changes have made the past 500 years a unique phase in the human journey. And so we end our semester's story at the doorstep of that next story, that doorstep of the modern age that makes up the curriculum of part 2 of this world history course. We have made a great journey ourselves from the Paleolithic era of our hunter-gatherer foraging ancestors this semester through the revolutions and globalizations of migration, of agriculture, of civilization building, and here in the last part of the course, of global trade. As the Strayer quote suggests, it is a story of enormous consequence, of enormous catastrophe, as well as a story of enormous growth. The history of the United States itself is entirely the product of that particular chapter in the story. But as I say, we end it here for now as we bring the world to the edge of modernity and prepare to take our final exam of the semester.